Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, in the lecture theatre here, and also, of course, if you're watching online. My name's Alistair McGrath, and I'm the Gresham Professor of Divinity. And in this lecture, the fourth of my final year as Gresham Professor, I want to look at this question, which I think some of you will find depressing, some of you will find stimulating, perhaps some of you will also find interesting. And that is, if we're so great, why is this world such a mess? And it's an interesting question. Obviously, I'll be giving you some of my ideas, but of course, I'll be bringing lots of other people into the conversation as well. And in many ways, the important thing is not what I think, but actually what you think. In many ways, I'm giving you lots of ideas to reflect on, to see if they make any sense and see where you might take it from them. So basically, here's the question we're going to be thinking about in this lecture. If human beings are so wonderful, and I think we like to think we are, then why do we seem to make such a mess of things? I think it's something that we always reflect on. Very often in history you find there are periods of great optimism, and then they give way to periods of great pessimism. You might think, for example, of the Roaring Twenties, when most Americans were very happy to buy into the general optimism of that age. And of course, as you know, basically the stock markets, like the world, seem to be going upwards. And then, of course, the bubble burst. And the Wall Street crash triggered a financial crisis in Germany, which of course gave Adolf Hitler the political impetus he needed to get elected, with the result that by 1934, Germany had actually turned Nazi. So I think there are some very interesting questions here. And I think that in many ways, events like the First World War, the Second World War, even more recent events. Now, many of you will know a very famous letter of Lord Acton, dating from 1887, in which he wrote that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, obviously, Acton might be wrong, but many would say this man has put his finger on something that's really important. He drew the conclusion, as you see, that great men are almost always bad men. But I think that it is a very important idea. And in fact, this anxiety really lies behind the tendency in most Western democracies to try and eliminate power being concentrated in one individual's hands. And I think that is a very important point to make. And certainly, you'll know that the British Prime Minister William Pitt, many years ago, made a further point which I think is relevant here. He wrote, "Unlimited power is apt to corrupt the minds of those who possess it." And I think that there's a very interesting point being made here, but I want to raise with you a question. Don't you think that Acton and Pitt here are really saying, look, human nature is fundamentally good and benign, and then power comes along and that good nature gets corrupted? In other words, we are innocent, then power comes along and that corrupts us. What if there's something already within us which actually leads us to express our true nature through power? And when we express that, it tends to be something really quite worrying. And some of you will know there's a very ancient Anglo-Saxon proverb. There's a collection of them up in Durham Cathedral. And this proverb runs like this: "Man does as he is when he can do what he wants." And the point being made there is that really it's when we can do anything we like, when there are no limitations on us, that we show the way we really are. So how can we make sense of this gulf between, to quote from Hazlitt, what we would like things to be and the way they actually are? And I think it's very important to make the point that human history seems to be littered with bright hopes which seem to turn into dismal failures. Now, of course, it doesn't always happen, but it happens a lot of times. And that, I think, is the sort of thing that makes us ask these questions. I mean, there are many technological developments and inventions which actually could enhance the quality of human life. But very often, these technological developments are used to make better weapons. And so there is a concern there, I think, about these tools at our disposal, which can be used for good or for ill, and we don't always, I think, use them rightly. So how do we make sense of this? Why is it that human nature seems, if I can put it like this, to destroy paradise? Well, many of you, I think, will know the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who rose to fame as one of the great dissidents of the Soviet Union, calling into question both its history and also its present-day manifestations. And the Gulag Archipelago, I think, is one of his finest works, because, as you will know, it exposes a system of forced labor, exile, and oppression. So where is the problem? Why did this happen? I think on a very naive reading of things, you'd expect Solzhenitsyn to say, well, of course, the problem here is Marxist, Leninist ideology. That really is the problem. Or maybe it's a Soviet Communist Party. Yet while Solzhenitsyn, I'm sure, saw those as possible contributions to the problem, he actually saw the problem as lying deeper. And here are some words that Solzhenitsyn gave when he spoke at Harvard some time ago. I'm going to read these to you and see what you make of them. He writes, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" Now, again, that's very provocative, but I think he raises what is a very fair and very interesting question. He's saying, look, it's so easy to say, I'm good, and there are the bad people. And Solzhenitsyn is saying, look, we may need to recognize that actually that sort of dichotomy exists within each of us. And maybe what we can do then is try and control the darker side and make sure that we express the brighter side in who we are and what we do. But this thought, I think, really is important. I'm not saying we should be pessimistic about human nature. I'm just saying we should be realistic. In other words, try and look at some of these questions and see what difference it makes to the way we think. So let's move away from Solzhenitsyn. Let's look at the Italian playwright Giuseppe Baretti, who's best known for a play in which he made Galileo say these words, "Eppur si muove," yet it still moves, which of course Galileo didn't say, but Baretti wrote a rather nice play about Galileo in which he put those words into his mouth. But during their grand tour of Europe in 1765-6, Samuel Johnson and his biographer James Boswell met with Baretti, and they seemed to have had a great time together, and they really got on very well. And one of the questions they came to was discussing the issue of human nature. And Baretti has a one-liner which I think is really interesting, and here it is. He says, "I hate mankind, for I think myself one of the best of them, and I know how bad I am." I think that's a nice little quote. I mean, he's basically saying, look, I think I'm pretty good by human standards, but I have to admit, how bad I am. So it's a witty remark, which I think is spoken largely in jest, but it does, I think, open up this question of human nature. And maybe this question was underexplored during the Victorian age. I mean, there are reasons why this might have been the case. For example, there was a virtual absence of a global conflict between the period 1815 to 1914. That's a long time without a major global conflict. And maybe that lulled people into a false sense of security. That we were entering into a period of relative tranquility. We belonged to the business of living, making money, and so on. Yet, of course, as we all know, the global explosion of war and destruction in the 20th century made it very clear that actually we're perfectly capable of doing this sort of thing again. So how can we cope with this darker side of humanity? What sort of conceptual frameworks can we use that might help us to make sense of it and even to do something about it? And I think that there are 5 ways in which you can kind of move away from this problem. I'm going to say we need to face up to it, but there are 5 strategies that people tend to use, in effect, to just say there isn't really a problem here at all. Let me tell you what these 5 strategies are and see whether this makes sense of you. One solution, of course, is to say, look, there isn't a problem at all. Any suggestion there's a flaw or a defect in humanity is basically, irrational nonsense. And so we sanitize our language to persuade ourselves that our flaws and our failings are actually virtues and strengths. So that's one way. Say, look, there isn't a problem. We don't need to worry about this. Or, secondly, what we can do is to ignore history or present the historical narrative in such a selective and reassuring way that disconfirming evidence is simply airbrushed out of the picture, rather like actually the way in which disgraced Soviet leaders were airbrushed out of pictures or replaced with potted palms during the 1920s. Or thirdly, what you could say is, well, look, being good and being human are the same. In other words, human beings are good by definition, and therefore to be good is simply to be human. And I'm sure that is the beginnings of a way of thinking about this. But I think that we do need to ask whether we need something more robust than that, which is saying maybe there is this dichotomy, this tension between what we do and what we know we could do or know we should do. In other words, that we need to transcend the limits of what we presently do and do better than that. Or fourthly, we might suggest that good and evil are simply social constructions without any basis in an objective reality. In other words, whether we think that we are good or bad, or whether we think that somebody else or something else is good or bad, really depends on the pre-commitments and prejudices of those who are judging, rather than the qualities of those who are being judged. And if that was so, of course, then good or evil would simply be the observer imposing this moral framework on other people. In other words, this is in effect not an objective statement about the real world, but simply somebody expressing an opinion about people they very often don't like very much. But there's a fifth category, which I think is the most dangerous, and I'm sure as I describe this, you'll recognize this. It's the approach that Solzhenitsyn warns against, and it's this. By declaring that humanity can be separated into two categories, good people and evil people. And it's those evil people who are responsible for the evils of our world, whereas, of course, the good people embody everything that is bright and hopeful and right. And, of course, the problem is that we automatically put ourselves in that category of good people, which is very flattering, of course, but the problem is that it ends up creating in-groups and out-groups. And it really could lead to the very disturbing suggestion that those who are placed in that group of evil people should be marginalized or eliminated, which I think is a very disturbing trend. So what I'm going to suggest is that we don't try to evade this problem. We just say, look, there seems to be something here that really is worth engaging with. We, as human beings, are perfectly capable of doing good. We're perfectly capable of doing evil. And unfortunately, we're very good at taking some good things and doing some pretty bad things with them. And I think, if we look at the two areas in which I specialize myself, both science and religion, I mean, they can do some pretty good things, but they can also go wrong. I think it's very important to emphasize that point. These things can go wrong. That doesn't mean that they are bad. It just means they are both thoroughly human undertakings. And that means that because we're human beings, we get caught up in all kinds of power dynamics, and very often these things go wrong. And Solzhenitsyn's experiences in the Soviet labor camp led him to realize, again, that quote I gave you, that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And Solzhenitsyn is asking us to, in effect, stop pointing the finger at someone else and look at ourselves instead. So that brings me to this novel, which I know many of you will have read. I suspect, like some of you, I was forced to read this novel at school. And I found it awful. And then, of course, when I actually read it again later, I thought, this is really rather good. But I didn't actually appreciate when I was forced to read it. But those of you who've read that book will know the rich issues that it opens up. For those of you who haven't read it, it's about a group of British schoolboys in the 1950s who are stranded on an isolated island in a remote region of the Pacific Ocean as a result of an aeroplane crash. And basically, the kids survive, and they start to figure out how to live on this island. And they set up the rudiments of civilization, and then things begin to go wrong. There's violence. There's all kinds of depravity, and basically, it's a story of dysfunctionality. In effect, things going wrong. Social norms are left to one side. Basically, the situation, to use that phrase from Abraham Lincoln, actually shows us up for who we really are. Now, obviously, you really need to read this novel to actually appreciate the reach of Golding's analysis. But one of the points he brings out is that very often our sense of good is only skin deep. And when we're put in a situation where more complex forces are there, we begin to behave in a rather different way. So what is going on here? I think one of the very interesting questions we can ask is whether there is something about us which in effect gives us the capacity to almost choose who we are. And that's a great theme of the Renaissance. And some of you will know a very interesting piece of writing that dates from the time of the Renaissance. And it's by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. I'll put it up on the screen in a moment. It's called The Oration on the Dignity of Humanity, and was given in 1486. And basically, this powerful orator rewrites the creation narratives of the book of Genesis. And what he does is to accentuate the creativity of humanity. And the idea he develops is this: in creating humanity, God gives human beings the capacity to choose where they would like to be placed in the realm of possibilities inside the created order. And so basically, the narrative, it's very improbable, it's very interesting. He's saying, look, because humanity was the last thing to be created, when humanity was created, all the existing categories were used up. And therefore, God gave humanity as the right to, in effect, choose what it would be. And here's the quote in which he develops this. This is his rewriting of the Genesis creation narrative. Some of you may find this rather annoying, but what I want to do is look at the approach he's developing. We've given you, Adam, neither a fixed dwelling place, nor a form that is yours alone, nor any function that is peculiar to you alone. This is so that you may have and possess whatever dwelling place, form, and functions you yourself may desire, according to your longing and judgment. The nature of all other beings is limited and constrained within the bands of laws prescribed by us. But you are constrained by no limits, and shall determine the limits of your nature for yourself, in accordance with your own free will, in whose hand we have placed you. Now, what I want to do is just go with this imaginative experiment. In other words, say, look, this isn't what the Genesis creation narrative says, but let's just go with this idea. What's the point he's making? And the point he's making is that actually we choose whether we reach up to become angels or reach down to become like the beasts of the field. And he's simply making this unsettling point that if our identity is indeterminate, then we end up choosing the kind of creatures we're going to be. And obviously he is setting before his audience the aspiration to reach for the angelic, to in effect show those qualities of goodness and integrity and all the rest of them. But he's saying also, but some of you will be going downwards because that's what you want to do and that's what you want to be. And while I have a lot of misgivings about this, I think actually it's a very interesting approach. And his standout point really is that we have the capacity to determine who we are or what we might become. And of course, if there is a darker side to our nature, then you can see that this really opens up ways of helping us to understand what is going on. And some of you may know G.K. Chesterton's words. Some years ago he wrote, "When once one begins to think of man as a shifting and alterable thing, it's always easy for the strong and crafty to twist him into new shapes." Again, many of you will have read Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, from 1932, in which he actually begins to map out what this dysfunctional and deeply unsettling world might look like. So one of the points I'm raising is whether we have a reluctance to actually ask these difficult questions about ourselves. And Rowan Williams, used to be Archbishop of Canterbury, once remarked, and I quote, that there is inbuilt into human beings a sort of dangerous taste for unreality. And the point that Williams is making is that very often we kind of way close our eyes to evidence that suggests all is not well and just focus on the evidence that says all does indeed seem to be well. And Williams is really saying we need to look at the darker things as well as those that actually seem to fit with our preconceived ideas. Human beings cannot live without illusion. And, you know, what sort of illusion does he have in mind? He's saying, well, maybe religion's an illusion, maybe politics is an illusion, maybe our belief that we are good is an illusion, but he's saying we need these illusions to cope with life. Now, that's unsettling. I'm not entirely sure I agree with him, but it's a very interesting point. He argues that any belief in moral progress is a superstition, his word, which is basically at a distance from the way things really are. And he argues that there's something about us which means that we reach for the latest technology and use it to do all kinds of things that reinforce the positions of the powerful. So let me explain in general terms what a theological notion of sin is like. It really is used to designate a flaw within human nature, which prevents us from achieving our true goals. It's not really a moral idea. It may become a moral idea, but actually it's more a sort of religious idea, and it's saying that if our relationship with God is damaged, this leads to all kinds of outcomes. And certainly we can use the word sin to designate individual actions which represent a failure to achieve our true goal, and also to the underlying human state, which gives rise to those individual acts of sin in the first place. So if you like, there's sin as actions, there's sin as an underlying condition. Or to switch the analogy to a more medical analogy, you could say that maybe sin is the illness which gives rise to individual sins as symptoms of that illness. And if that is so, then of course, there's a limit to the utility of saying stop doing that, when if we use this medical model, we are required to be cured of what is that causes us to do this in the first place. Now, of course, many would say, well, this idea of sin needs to be critiqued. I mean, many philosophers in 18th century France felt it was an insult to human dignity. It's suggesting that human beings were flawed and fallible, prone to selfishness and violence. But I have a feeling that, this may be rather over-defensive, that actually maybe there is something here that we need to take very, very seriously. Because one of the great concerns that a number of political philosophers have, John Gray is one of those who's concerned about this, is that if we have idealized views of human nature, we will also have idealized views of society. And we get frustrated because we cannot achieve them, and therefore we decide to achieve them in our own ways. And of course, that is really quite unacceptable. So I think there are issues to look at here. I think that the idea of sin really is important. And of course, the point I'm going to make is that, this narrative, this framework, I think is quite helpful in answering difficult questions. And here is a difficult question, which I think we need to think about. Why is it that every human institution seems to subvert its own goals? I mean, look, let me give you an example. The Christian church regularly falls victim to social forces and pressures, such as, for example, the need to accumulate financial resources. And in the pursuit of those resources, many would say, and I think I'd be very sympathetic to this, actually lose sight of, or perhaps even lose altogether the original vision which drives it. That's a real concern. Countless institutions, whether they are religious or secular, find themselves collapsing or failing through human flaws. Because what I want to do here is quote to you from the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. And he basically says, look, there are flaws in human institutions. There are flaws in human society. But we so often say, that's society. Whereas I'm an individual, I'm good, society's bad. And Niebuhr was saying, no, I'm sorry, the problem lies partly in you. He writes, the flaws in human institutions arise from corresponding flaws in human nature itself. To use Ban Ki-moon's phrase, the cancer doesn't just lie in the system, but in the individual human beings that make it up. And actually, that's one of the reasons why Reinhold Niebuhr, who became very interested in politics, was so respectful of the American constitutional system, precisely because it had so many checks and balances intended to stop any one person from becoming all-powerful and able to do things. Everything had to be checked. And I think that's a very important point. Niebuhr thought we had to develop workable means of preventing the excessive concentration of power. So I think there's some very interesting points here. I'm not in any way saying that we're pessimistic about human nature or indeed our potentials. I'm saying we do need to say there are these darker sides to things, and we need to incorporate this into our thinking to make it realistic and informed. So that is a point I want to emphasize. I think this is quite good, but see what you make of it. Murdoch here is simply making this point that we like to think we look at the world and we see ourselves as we really are, whereas in fact very often we're looking at ourselves through rose-tinted glasses. By opening our eyes, we do not necessarily see what confronts us. Our minds are continually active, fabricating an anxious, usually self-preoccupied, often falsifying veil which partially conceals the world. Well, let me give you her answer. I quite like this answer, but I'm not sure how realistic it is. Basically, Iris Murdoch says it is good art that helps us break free from our own deceptions and preoccupations. A good work of art, she says, in fact brings us out of ourselves and enables us to critique ourselves and become the better people we're meant to be. And I think I can see what she says, and I have met people who have said that they were really helped to move on by reading a particular novel or by looking at some very helpful picture. But I'm not sure that everyone would find this experience quite as helpful or quite as transformative as Iris Murdoch obviously did. For Murdoch, great art, and this is a quote from Murdoch, shows us the world as we were never able so clearly to see it before. In other words, it's like a lens which allows us to focus in to see things more clearly than would otherwise be the case. And so Murdoch's argument is that our tendency for self-deception can be broken by the imaginative or moral power of great art, which allows us to see ourselves from outside and self-created webs of meaning. Murdoch sees this as a possible answer, but art is a preferred answer. The other answer, of course, is education. It's by educating people that you enable them to catch a vision of something bigger, that you give them an alternative way of seeing things, a different set of moral values, and that, of course, is transformative. And all of us, I think, will be very, very sympathetic to that. That in effect, it's about trying to give people a new vision of reality. But again, I do want just to exercise caution. And I'm going to take up a theme which George Steiner, the well-known philosopher, picked up on in a series of lectures about 20 years ago. This is his reflection. We know that a man can read Goethe or Rilke in the evening, that he can play Bach and Schubert and go to his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning. Now, what Steiner was picking up on was this, in his view, and of course this was his own background. I mean, Germany was the most cultured of nations. And yet this had come out of that. How? What went wrong? And in effect, he was reduced to despair that a nation which invested so heavily in good education at secondary and tertiary levels seemed to produce people like this capable of doing these things. And his point, I think, is important. Now, I have to say I personally doubt if many of those running these death camps did read Goethe or even capable of playing Bach or Schubert. So here is Bertrand Russell, a philosopher who I greatly admire. He writes beautifully, and here, man, he writes, is a rational animal. So at least I've been told. Throughout a long life, I've looked diligently for evidence in favor of this statement, but so far, I have not had the good fortune to come across it. We need to think about human nature, ourselves and corporate gatherings of people. And obviously I've offered you a number of approaches. I've looked at the religious approach, and you may, as I've been talking, have thought, some of you, of a passage from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, which actually captures this dilemma quite well. I can will what is right, but I can't do it. For I don't do the good I want, but the evil I don't want is what I do. So in this lecture, I've raised a lot of questions. I'm going to end with a quote from Ovid. This is from his Metamorphosis. And look at this. I see and approve of the better, but I follow the worse. And that seems to me to be a very fitting way of ending this lecture, simply to say there's a problem here. But, if you realize there's a problem, that might help you do something about it. So, let me just tell you that the next lecture is on 27th of March, and then I shall be asking, how is it that we can fit into this universe? How can we feel at home in a vast, complex universe? What do we mean in that context? Again, I'll be throwing lots of ideas at you just to see what you think. The important thing is not what I think, but kind of way what you think, and I'm trying to catalyze you in your thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.